Bonsoir à toutes, bonsoir à tous. Merci d'être là pour cette
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for being here for this second evening of our week at the École de l'Anthropocène. So our debates are going to continue. They're going to run over from the discussion yesterday on the habitability of the planet. And this evening, we're going to be focusing on the conquering of space. And we're going to be dealing with space through the eyes of a certain number of specialists on geopolitical issues, archaeological, legal issues, but also via an author, a very important author, in the sector of what we call science fiction that enables us to work on our imagination as he has. He's worked on his imagination to take us to a wide variety of planets that have been conquered by man. So we're going to have a two-pronged evening. First of all, Vincent Deschamps, who is present here, who is the director of the RIS, this site that is hosting the event. So a very big thank you to you, sir, for hosting the event. First of all, we'll have a conversation of 45 minutes approximately with Kim Stanley Robinson, who is a great science fiction author, as I was saying, who writes books that are very, very striking for those who love science fiction. And he'll explain exactly how he works. And following on from this conversation, we'll continue. Good evening, Kim. You're on the screen. We can see you. And following on from this first conversation, we will then have a debate between Isabelle Sourbès-Verger, who is a geographer, a historian, and a specialist in geopolitical issues in relation to circumterrestrial space and its conquering. And we have Alice Gorman, who will be present from Adelaide in Australia. It's very, very early for her. And she is a specialist in the archaeology of space. And we'll be working together on analysing the conquest of circumterrestrial space and what it tells us about our terrestrial society. So I wish you a very good evening, and I'll be responsible for leading the debate for the second part of the evening. And let me now leave you with Kim Stanley Robinson and Vincent Deschamps, and thank you once again for being with us.
Alors, Kim Stanley Robinson,
So, Kim Stanley Robinson, once again, I'd like to say hello to you. We said good evening to each other just a few moments ago. So I really am delighted to have you here with us this evening. And to introduce the conversation we're going to be having, there are three subjects, I believe, that are very important and that, from my point of view, illustrate that something is very topical at the current time. In other words, this idea of conquest, space conquest, seems to be making something of a comeback, a form of extension, particularly in terms of the Eucumene. In other words, the Eucumene being occupied by man. There are three main points that I would like to focus on to get the ball rolling and to start talking about the geopolitical challenges, first of all, that are gradually being confirmed or maybe called into question, revolving around what we call the occupational projects, occupying the Earth's orbit, for example. We see satellite coverage that is increasing at a very fast rate. All of these satellites are gradually invading space. There are also those projects that are becoming very topical concerning the return to the moon. In other words, the moon just being a springboard to then move on to Mars. That is the next target, as we say. And so we can imagine all of the challenges, scientific, political, and economic, that underpin all of these projects. The second main topical issue, I would argue, is what we could call the new actors when it comes to the conquest of space. And I'm sure this is very evocative to you. In other words, it's no longer simply the great capitalistic powers, the geopolitical powers that be around the world. In other words, the states, as was the case during the Cold War. But today we have capitalistic powers, transnational powers that are incarnated by people such as Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos. And then the last subject that I think is very topical that really struck me, but not only me, it's this passion, this current passion that humanity seems to have for the discovery of exoplanets and new territories. And we've seen the massive amounts of money that are being invested with James Webb's telescope that has been sent into orbit. And so these are three main subjects that, from my perspective, set the scene. And it's very good because you're one of the major authors who actually helps us to think about all these issues. You've been doing this for several decades, since the 1970s. You have a corpus literary that is a literary corpus that is just so enjoyable and so interesting. And you focus on both fiction and science. And to introduce you, Kim Stanley Robinson, and you must say whether you agree or not. I personally would say that you are unusual or singular when it comes to contemporary science fiction from two perspectives. The first point I would like to raise is that you place yourself in a specific time frame. In other words, you focus on time and space in a very original manner. Let me be specific here. You don't focus on what we call long time. We're not talking about Herbert, Dune, Star Wars, a long time ago in a faraway galaxy, far, far away. We're not in this kind of space, but we're not in what we call short time anticipation either. We're in what I would call a form of intermediate space, several hundreds of years ahead. And yes, it's a very intermediate space. It's not a distant galaxy. More often than not, for the most part, there is an exception that we'll talk about when we talk about aurora, but generally speaking, we're in the solar system. And so first of all, I'd like to ask you the question, Kim Stanley Robinson, why this choice of a scale of space and time that is yours, that is what I call intermediate, and it's very specific to you?
Well, thank you for that very much. I appreciate the question because I myself have analyzed science fiction as being stories set in the future. And most of them are either the far future, and we call that space opera in America. As you described it, distant galaxies into millions of years in the future with powers that are magical. Or what I called near future science fiction, the day after tomorrow, a sense of the present slightly extended to show trajectories of the present. These are both valid and entertaining fictional spaces. I've done a lot of near future. I haven't done very much that you could call space opera, if any, but a little bit. And then that intermediate zone that you identified is indeed what I have felt is important and interesting and underwritten by science fiction writers. So I sometimes call it future history, a bit, but not in the Asimov sense, but in the sense of it's exactly what you said, maybe a half century to about 300 years out from now is thinkable as a kind of a future realism. You can stick to the laws of physics. You can stick to the neighborhood, by which I mean the solar system, which is technically within our reach. As with the technologies we have now, you don't need magic. The solar system is our neighborhood, cosmically speaking. And even Neptune is way closer to Earth than the closest star by magnitudes, by distances that are very hard to properly imagine for human beings. And on the time scale, humans are going to be on Earth and struggling with climate change and with all the problems we're dealing with now. 200 years from now, that struggle will be ongoing, and it's interesting to contemplate. And as a kind of since this conference is on the impacts of space, in the next 200 years, the neighborhood, which is to say the solar system, it won't be critical to human history, I don't believe, but it will be interesting and helpful and part of the story. And since it's a kind of an empty ecological niche in our cultural imaginary, I've found my stories there very often.
Now, another thing that is very singular about the way in which you write, if you don't mind, is the fact that you make a very strong claim for the science fiction label, science plus fiction. You assume the fact that, yes, you write fiction, you write novels, yes, you're also very sensitive to poetry, to language, and yet at the same time, you feed on science, or sciences in the plural, hard and soft sciences, social sciences, to produce a very, very strong reality effect. I know it's something you also lay claim to. Now, what I'd like you to do is explain to us what has led you during the course of your intellectual endeavours to position yourself in this way, somewhere at the crossroads between science and fiction.
Well, thank you for this also. It has been a crucial question to my life as an artist. And I myself have been mystified as to why I chose this route. But when I ran into science fiction in the early 1970s, it was a revelation, and I felt that I had come to my place in literature. It could be that my childhood in orange groves, replaced by a city, was the thing that made me feel that science fiction was a kind of a realism. And so I come to it as an English major and as a novelist. I would like to write a good novel. But what is a good novel in 1980 and in 2020? Over the stretch of my long career, I would say a good novel has to take into account reality. That's one of the things that it attempts to do, is to almost define social and personal reality, to give our lived experience its meaning. And therefore, the sciences are crucial. We live in a world that has been created by science and that is sustained by science. And also, as a novelist, I'm a storyteller, the new stories are coming out of the sciences. So if you do what you could call domestic realism or mainstream literature or literary fiction, I don't even know what the term would be in French. But in America, those would be the terms. You're stuck in the early 20th century in terms of form and content. The life of the bourgeois subject and their immediate surroundings, their personal crises. You haven't taken on history or the planet. And science fiction does that all the time. So to get right to the answer of your question, my main drive would be to write a good novel, which requires exactly what Roland Barthes termed l'effet du réel, the effect of the real. When you're reading it, you want to feel that it's real. And I felt like diving into the sciences has strengthened the reality effect of my novels. Now, this is a little paradoxical because setting stories in the future means immediately a level of fictionality. How can you be both realistic and set a story in the future? Well, this has been my problem to solve in book after book.
Alors, je vous propose maintenant, Kim Stanley Robinson, de partir.
I suggest now, Kim Stanley Robinson, that we go off on a journey. We're going to go off on a journey through some of your books, the books that I would qualify as being the extraterrestrial books. And there's one that I'm very, very sensitive to that is called Icehenge in English. It's the French translation is not the same, but in the English version, it refers to Stonehenge and a glass monument that's been found on Pluton in the planet. It's in 2610. So from what I understand, it's a long way ahead. It's the most distant projection that you provide us with. And this book, I believe, focuses on all of the major themes that you then develop further down the line. Do you agree with this?
Yes, maybe that's true. And this is good because Alice will come on next and be talking about space archaeology. And Icehenge is specifically about a fictional space archaeological project. The first people to go to Pluto discover a human monument already there. Who put it there and when and why? And I think it's called Les Menhirs du Glace in French. And that's a pretty good translation. And I'd like to see the menhirs in person someday in Brittany and Normandy. So the other addition to that story was lifetime extension. And the reason I put it in the year 2600 was in part to allow the effect of thinking about long human lifetimes to really impact the reader, to make a new story. So if humans were to live 500 years, but they only remembered their childhood like by flashes of lightning, and then the last 30 years of their life, that wouldn't be much different from the way our memories work now, but there would be a giant gap of unremembered lived experience. So you also would be an archaeologist of your own life as you tried to remember what you've done. And people might remember you that you don't remember. Again, this happens to us now, but with vastly extended lifetimes, you could also have an archaeologist who has a theory of where this ice henge came from. Everybody believes him, and he lives long enough to see that he has been fooled and that it was a hoax and that he was taken in by a hoax. Typically, archaeologists die before their work is revealed to be inaccurate. And as a news story, I thought to combine these two new strands. To end this, thank you for asking about Icehenge. I'm fond of it. It's the first work of mine that I was pleased with. And I would say that it began all kinds of strands of thought that I've never stopped exploring. In particular, human civilization spread through the solar system on the planetary bodies that we could reach and possibly inhabit.
Alors, une grande partie de ce premier
Now, a lot of this first book, a big portion of the first book, Icehenge, takes place in March. And now we're going to head for Mars specifically. And we're going to focus on the trilogy. We're going to focus on Red Mars, Green Mars. Then there's the Martians from 1999. And in the middle, we have Blue Mars. How come you wanted to talk about Mars for so long in so much detail, over 2,000 pages, over a decade approximately? And how did you do it in a new way compared to a long tradition and to your contemporaries? You personally, what you offer to us is something that is radically new.
Yes, thank you for that. I agree. And what happened was this: the Viking landers, Mariner and Viking, in 1969 and 1976, gave us Mars in an enormous amount of detail that we had never had before. So you could not have written anything like the Mars trilogy before 1976. And it took a while to assimilate all that new data. And I also was gathering my strength as a novelist. It was clear to me that the story of inhabiting and terraforming Mars would be an epic novel requiring some formal techniques that I didn't know about, that I somewhat had to invent or adapt from earlier novels that covered huge spans of time. For me, about 200 years. The novel usually covers a human lifetime or less. And the multi-generational saga is not very satisfying, but here, lifetime extension from Icehenge came into play, and I realized I could have characters live through the entire stretch of the terraforming of Mars by the science fictional device, which is probably the most fantastical of all my science fiction devices, because lifetime extension is very hard, as we're finding. So I had a chance to talk about utopia, and I had a chance to talk about wilderness and landscape, because we had this extraordinary planet, which is what we found out is that its geological features are tremendously ancient compared to Earth's, because there's been no tectonic plate movement on Mars for a couple of billion years. And we also have got gigantic features on Mars, so that the biggest volcano is 100 times bigger than the biggest volcano on Earth. The biggest canyon is 100 times bigger than the biggest canyon on Earth. Now, 100 times, that's big. That's almost unimaginable, but there we could see it in the satellite photos. And at the time, the scientists were saying we might be able to terraform Mars. That opinion has been somewhat compromised in the decades since I finished. But while I was working, I was trying to stay within the parameters of what the real scientists were telling us about what was possible on Mars. And it was an exciting opportunity. And here's the main point. It was an exciting opportunity to write a novel about a new story. So I took it as a novelist, not as a futures planner, not as a social designer. Whether it's a good idea for us to try to inhabit Mars, now I have no opinion. Whether it was a good idea to write a novel about this project, I'm still convinced it was a good idea when I did it.
Alors, vous dites en avoir fini avec Mars. Alors,
now, you say that you've finished with Mars. I would imagine that on the odd occasion you do pay attention, you do show an interest to a certain extent in what is said about Mars. But what about at the current time regarding the planet? What do you think? And in particular, what do you think about the founders of SpaceX who were selling to us the terraformation of Mars? What do you think is a very current discourse on the future of a conquest, the conquest of Mars?
They're making an error, a category error. They're not paying attention to the most recent science, and they're not paying attention to the climate crisis, an existential crisis on Earth. Right now, Mars is irrelevant. It has no bearing on the emergency that is the main project of humanity in this century, which is to adjust human civilization to the biosphere that supports it in a sustainable way. So I'm surprised anybody is paying attention to Mars right now. It's exactly as important as Antarctica, although maybe less so. Antarctica is important because we need its ice to stay there. But humans in Antarctica are scientists doing scientific studies. It's interesting, it's beautiful, it's important for understanding Earth. Mars is precisely the same. To have humans there would be like scientists in Antarctica. It would be interesting, it would be beautiful, it would teach us things that might help us to manage Earth as a planet, to finesse or deal with or cope with problems we've created, because comparative planetology is a real important aspect of human maintenance of Earth. So I'm not saying that Mars is completely irrelevant as a site of scientific study. I'm saying that Mars is irrelevant as an important aid to human civilization right now. And I now regard it as a reward. If we were to come into a good balance with Earth, if we make a sustainable civilization on Earth, we'll know it. The CO2 in the atmosphere will start going down. The mass extinction event will be dodged. There will be more justice and equality amongst humans, less suffering. The human population will stabilize and probably begin to go down. And at that point, only at that point, Mars becomes interesting again as a space for human imagination and perhaps inhabitation. It's not right to call it colonization because it's not going to be a colony. Terraforming might be a 10,000-year project rather than a 200-year project. That means it's still a legitimate idea. But for private interests right now to be thinking about Mars or speaking about it as if it were important, it's as if they've taken science fiction too seriously as a blueprint. And I'm going to say, as a novelist, as one of the foremost living Martians, that this is an entirely hypothetical and literary project. And as a real idea, at best, it's a hobby. I'd be interested to know. I think that in French, there is the word for hobbies, and French implies exactly what it would be in English. It's something you do on the side to entertain yourself in your leisure time. It's not important. Your hobby is a kind of a personal quirk of your personality. And that's what Mars is for anybody who's serious about it today.
Oui, donc cet échappatoire.
So basically, it's kind of a hobby, as you said. It's a kind of escape route for a lot of these people. We'll come back to that maybe before we close our discussion. Maybe one final comment with regard to what we've been saying, a very strong vision of our future, which is very present today, which is the fact that this planet, Mars, is obviously appropriate in your narrative. It's conquered and it's terraformed or habited by the transnationals. And this is quite important with regard to what's being said today, with regard to the conquest of space today, and the appearance of these new stakeholders, these new actors. I want to know if you think this is still something very topical in what you write about, and more particularly in the Mars trilogy.
Yes, I am interested, very interested, as everyone should be, in how humanity behaves in space, treats space, and legislates space as we go forward from now. Because our capabilities in low Earth orbit, our capabilities in space telescopes, we will almost certainly return to the moon in this decade. And in theory, although it's extremely difficult and dangerous, we could perhaps land on Mars. But to keep it in the Earth system, Earth and the moon, there's you can make money now with communication satellites connecting up the world. So the internet is partly a phenomenon of space and could be more so. Then also the scientific information that we get out of low Earth orbit and on the moon is valuable to us in dealing with climate change. And then lastly, there are certain resources, and there's also satellites. There are problems you can ask me more specifically about, but let me bring this answer to a close by saying space should be regarded as a commons, like the ocean, can't be owned by anybody, but commercial activities can take place there, maybe. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 was based on the Antarctic Treaty. It has always been controversial, and it never had much applicability. So, in other words, it was legislating a situation that didn't yet exist. And when the situation came into being, the Outer Space Treaty was too weak and somewhat ignored. It still obtains, the signatories are still signers. And so now push has come to shove. And one of the most interesting problems, and I hope Alice will talk about this, too many satellites will ruin ground-based astronomy and also ruin humanity's sense of the night sky as a natural and sublime, magnificent, and overwhelming experience. If it's junked up by thousands of moving lights, then the night sky is a commons that is of spiritual value, and the satellites may ruin it. So now we really do have a problem. Who rules in space, and will they be obeyed? And if people are bad actors, is there any possibility of undoing their bad actions? And these are all present questions.
On se met de côté précieusement ces considérations, ces ouvertures.
Yes, so we're going to put those considerations to one side for the time being, the question of commons and a law and who writes the law and who prevails in space. And I'd just like to continue our journey. You were suggesting we come back to Earth now, and the comparison with the Antarctic has come back on several occasions. And you say that, in fact, it's Mars, with its 2 feet firmly on the ground. So let's come back to Earth. And this is basically what happens in Aurora that you published in 2015. So this novel, Aurora, which is quite different from your usual fields of investigation, because it talks about a fragment of humanity which tries to escape from the solar system to go to the Tau Ceti planet of Aurora. And basically, it's quite pathetic because this expedition, which is led over several generations, fails. And basically, they have to come back. They're forced to come back to Earth because of the dangerous nature of a toxin which is present on this planet. So that's not the only danger. There are several dangers. But I'd like you to talk about this work, Aurora, which I think is out of the ordinary for you. And it's very different to your previous works because it's a change of scale, but also it raises questions as to the limitations, but also it really brings us back firmly onto the ground. So, and back to Earth, sorry. So could you comment on the conclusion of this work? There's about 30 or so magnificent pages written by the ocean. So this is the conclusion of this return to Earth and the final burst of this novel. What's it all about?
Yes, thank you for that. I'm interested to describe that project. I began to believe that the science fiction story, which is a more general cultural idea also, that humanity is destined to go to the stars, was wrong and was a fantasy based on a misapprehension of the size of the universe and the complexity of human biology. So part of this came in right with Hubble. The idea that humanity would go to the stars is an old idea. Ancient Greeks or 19th century Tsiolkovsky in Russia, a dream. And they didn't know until Hubble did his discoveries in astronomy, the true size of the universe, and never took on that information that the stars are too far away. And if you regard light speed as an absolute limit, which I'm going to say you ought to, then even at a considerable percentage of light speed, it takes too long to get to the stars. And so science fiction had solved that problem by what is called the multi-generational starship. It's not magic. You get in a starship that is hopefully very capacious and filled, like Noah's Ark, filled with everything you would want when you got there. And then you'd cross the big spaces between stars by multi-generations living within it as if it was their world. And for many generations, it would be their one and only world, the interior of the starship. And then I heard about the microbiome, our gut microbiome. 50% of the DNA in your body is not human DNA. And at that point, I thought, no, this story is impossible. Humanity can't stay healthy, stuck inside a set of rooms, which is what a starship would be, for multiple generations away from Earth. And I began to realize something that the sciences are telling us. Humanity is an expression of Earth. It co-evolved with Earth. The magnetic field, the air pressure, the chemical composition, everything about the way Earth is, humanity has evolved to live within those constraints. That being the case, the starship dream is a fantasy. Well, okay, most people, I think, would have said, we always knew that. Why are you making a big deal of it? What I wanted to do was kill the idea that humanity is destined for the stars and that Earth, as Tsiolkovsky put it, is humanity's cradle. Earth is humanity's cradle, he said, but you're not meant to stay in your cradle forever. That was wrong. Earth is humanity's cradle, its hotel, its grave. It's the whole story for humanity is Earth. There is no planet B. This is a bumper sticker in America. I hope it's a phrase in every language. There is no planet B. The best candidate, Mars, is a 10,000-year project, maybe. But the stars, no, we'll never go there. And that means we have to take care of Earth if humanity is going to stay healthy over the long haul. So with Aurora, I wanted to make that case with a flourish. And so coming back to Earth at the end, let me add one more thing. If we were to get to a planet somewhere else, and I had to invent one around Tau Ceti because we know the planets around Tau Ceti, none of them are any good for us, but there might be an Earth-sized moon rotating around one of them that we don't know about. I got help from NASA scientists all through this book, I must say. So if we get to another planet, it is either alive or dead. If it's dead, you have to terraform it with only the resources of a single starship. That's hard and bad. It extends the lifetime of your time in the starship by perhaps double what you've already been there. If the planet is alive, that the life forms on that planet will either be poisonous to you, or else you might be poisonous to them, or you might be innocuous to each other. It could be anything, but it's a big problem. And how do you test that? Do you go out into the atmosphere and see if you die or not? Well, no. How do you test that? You send some rats in a cage out on the surface, see if they live or die. I mean, once you acknowledge that problem, you realize we can't go to the stars for many, many reasons that add up together to a near impossibility. So I needed to tell that story, and I needed to come back to Earth and show that Earth has been damaged by this space dream, people not paying attention, not taking care of their one and only home. So they actually are rebuilding the beaches artificially that our starfarers return to at the end of the story. I think the novel has had an impact on the thinking of the science fiction community. As to the larger culture, I can't say.
Et pour juste illustrer un tout petit peu.
So, just to illustrate to a certain extent some of the things that you say, I would love to have been able to read extracts in French, unfortunately, but we lack time. But I would have liked to refer to the end of your book, Aurora. You write, we were tempted to stabilize the climate, the planet, etc., but nothing worked. It just didn't happen. And it would take a few more, 2,000 more years for that to be the case. Loose translation. Yes, the planet that now needs to be terraformed. It's Earth. We have no choice. The return to Earth, we don't have the choice. We have no choice but to do this. And there's one novel that isn't translated, but I know that you wrote very recently. This is a real turning back to the Earth. It's all about going back 40,000 years, going back 40,000 years. It takes place at the level of the Chauvet cave or grotto. Can you tell us exactly why and how you felt interested? Why did you want to come back to life, to the Earth, and go back in time? Is it because it helps you at the same time? Is it because it helps you to think of what comes next, the prolongation of Homo sapiens?
Well, yes, that is one of the main reasons that I wrote Shaman is if you're writing science fiction, well, there's two aspects to this. One, science fiction divides down into subgenres, and I wanted to write a novel in each of the subgenres of science fiction. The space story, the planet story, the near future dystopia, the alternative history, and traditionally prehistory, the story of humans before there was history, has been included as part of a science fiction subgenre for interesting reasons, because it's the history that we can never quite know before written history and then the future. This is unknowable history is what science fiction often does. So I had always been interested. And then when the Chauvet caves were discovered around 1995, I was fascinated. They were twice as old as Lascaux, and this art style was the same. Imagine the cultural continuities where for thousands of years, without writing, human cultures were keeping steady in their lifestyles and in their art forms, and I would presume in their languages. This is astonishing and worth investigating for itself. And then this science fiction question of what could we become as human beings, it rests on a question of how did we become what we are? So the historical continuity, if you try to think forward, You need to think backwards. And then again, it was a new story. There was no way, archaeology itself as a science has given us new ways to think the Paleolithic period. We know more about 30,000 years ago, human life, than we have ever known. That will continue, but it's almost like Mars. There's been an explosion of information coming from DNA studies and new discoveries. So I'm happy to report, to end this part, that Shaman will appear in French, since it's almost the only novel. Well, that's not quite true. My novels go to France fairly often. The Mars trilogy, The Years of Rice and Salt, and Shaman, though, is entirely set in France, almost. And so it will be published in France by Bragelonne I think in the late 2022. And I'm really happy to report that. I've wanted that ever since it came out.
Merci pour l'information.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the information. So we will follow that very closely in 2022. And to close, and also to link to the exchange that is going to take place, moderated by Michel Lusso, you've focused on law with a capital L, and you've talked about how important potentially it is to investigate this question, to focus on the extension of the ecumen. You've talked about the common good that can be discussed in a very fluctuating manner. And just very briefly, I wanted to submit to you also a new way of thinking about our relationship with the environment and with non-humans. And this involves the idea whereby we confer a legal entity nowadays upon certain components of the environment. It could be the Amazonian forest, for example. It could be the moon. I could refer to the Moon Declaration that Alice Gorman will refer to, or rather the Declaration of the Moon. And this way of thinking and acting, is it something that speaks to you, that is meaningful to you? And is this something that you think can be transposable? Can the moon, can Mars be made into legal entities? Can they be made into fully fledged entities? Do you think that resonates with a certain number of your analyses?
It's a very good question. And I would say that the distinction that makes it a difficult one is the presence of life or the absence of life. So a forest should be a citizen, a river should be a citizen. In Ecuador, in New Zealand, in Wales, around the world, we're beginning to see that living creatures and ecosystems, animals and biomes, are achieving legal standing so that they can be defended in court by humans who speak for them. And law is crucial. So, but what about a dead object like the moon, a rock in space? Well, you don't want to be looking up at it and seeing advertisements. It has a deep connection to human evolution, to the evolution of life on Earth. It would be the same thing as the satellites littering the sky so that you can't see the stars well anymore, but just our own moving objects. It would be bad enough that perhaps the defense of it should not be for any intrinsic value, as they put it in environmental ethics, of the moon per se, but a human utilitarian value in that it has a non-economic but powerfully real value to us as itself untrammeled. And that will have legal ramifications. If you're doing stuff on the moon that you can't see from Earth, does it matter? And isn't it okay if it helps humanity one way or another? A scientific base at the South Pole where there's frozen water, that kind of endeavor seems to me to be a valid human endeavor where the moon does not speak and wouldn't care because it's unconscious. So there's something strange about the moon and Mars where the kind of environmental ethics and legal standing that we're trying to work up for living systems of our biosphere on Earth So Gaia should have legal standing. But the moon, maybe this is just a rock that humans make what they will of. There will be complications legally as to who gets to do what up there. But I don't think the moon intrinsically as its own object is an actor in this actor network, or not a legally valid person in the way that I would say an antelope or a river is a legally valid person, a river biosphere. So these are questions that obviously get complicated and interesting, and we'll be hearing more about that from Alice, I'm sure. And I'm glad that they're being talked about now. This is the great thing about talking about them now, is that as they hit us, as they come so fast, we'll have some mental preparation and maybe even some legal thought already given to the problem.
Merci, un très grand merci.
Thank you, a very, very big thank you. Thank you to you, Kim Stanley Robinson. We're now getting to the end of our discussion, to the end of our exchange. Thank you so much for having dedicated time to us. Thank you for having made yourself available. Thank you so much also for having commented in detail on your books. Thank you for giving us the keys to the door to understanding your books and the keys to understanding the world in which we live. You provide us with a massive amount of resources, food for thought. So please do continue to make us travel, journey through time and space, and please do continue to help us position ourselves in such a complex world and time period. So I repeat, thank you ever so much. And we really do look forward to reading your latest book that you said will very soon be published in France and that takes place in Ardèche. Thank you very much.
Well, I want to say quickly thank you for your questions, which were, I love them because they were new and yet right what I think about when I'm thinking. And then I want to thank my French editor, Tom Clegg of Bragelonne, for his immense help in getting my last several novels into French. And now with Tom's work, all of my novels will end up being translated into French. And that means a great deal to me. It's the one and only language that I have struggled into a semi-reading comprehension of. And I hope to see people in person in the coming few years in France if the pandemic allows. So thank you very much.
Merci.
Thank you. Thank you so much.